Hello everyone. Today my story will take us along the Silk Road. The Silk Road is one of these exotic terms we have all more or less heard about, but sometimes without knowing exactly what it was and when it existed, or even why it is relevant. And this is what I would like to discover with you today. Before I start my story, I wanted to quickly thank all of you who participated in the poll I had organized to select one of the next topics I will talk about. The history of the Vikings won your vote, so I will try to upload it in the coming days. But returning to our story about the Silk Road, maybe we should start with a quick definition. In fact, the name Silk Road was coined recently in the 19th century to name a series of trade routes between Asia, China mainly, and the Mediterranean Sea. And for almost 2 millenniums, starting in the antiquity until the end of the Middle Age, this axis of trade and communication maintained a link between extremely different civilizations, such as the early Chinese Empire and the Greeks or the Romans. Through this axis, ideas, religions, inventions circulated. It changed the face of the countries that it crossed, and I am also going to talk about the remains of this Silk Road, and it even created its own legends, its fabulous tales of travels, including, as an example, the tales of Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, who from Europe to China was one of the rare men in history to travel the entire Silk Road. Generally, when we talk about the antiquity, we tend to focus on a given region. When we talk about ancient China, ancient Egypt, the Greek or the Roman civilizations. But actually, we know that the Romans, as early as in the 4th century before Christ, 2.5 millenniums ago, vaguely knew about the existence of China. They knew silk and a few other products coming from the Far East, and the Chinese, on the other hand, also knew that other people, other civilizations and resources could be found in the West, very far from their country. There are even prehistorians who date the first segments of the Silk Road almost 7 millenniums ago, especially with the appearance of the Jade Road. The Jade Road was a commercial link, shorter than the Silk Road but still fairly long, that the Chinese had established with the mountainous regions in Central Asia, where resources like jade, a very precious stone for the Chinese, and horses could be found. We don't exactly know how this first segment was extended towards the west, but it is likely that entering in contact with other people in the north of India, in Central Asia, the Chinese started to trade with them, and from one human group to another, progressively, this Silk Road appeared in following various itineraries in the plains of Central Asia, in the north of India, and continued west to Persia, and then the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, that for a short period of time extended to the whole of Persia and large parts of Central Asia. From there, once in contact with the Greeks, and in the following centuries, the Romans became the west end of the Silk Road, especially as they had a strong appetite for some of the luxury products that came from China. There were many different types of goods and resources that were traded along the Silk Road. The majority of them did not really go from the Mediterranean Sea to China or vice versa. They were traded along the road, and they included precious stones, fabric, ceramics, jade, amber, ivory, spices, or even glass and lacquer. In the 2nd century before Christ, when on the western part of the Silk Road the Roman Empire was quickly expanding, in about a century it would conquer Egypt and extend further towards the east. The emperor of China from the Han dynasty, an emperor called Hu, became officially interested in this road, and it was organized on the Chinese side, starting from a city called Xi'an today, Shanghan historically, which was the oriental end of the Silk Road. And a Chinese general was sent towards the west to officially open and pacify this Silk Road. This contrasts quite a lot with the image we have about China, because when the first European explorers would reach China centuries later, in the 16th century, they discovered a country which still had a brilliant civilization, but very focused on its own culture, with a limited curiosity for the rest of the world, and a belief that it was the one and only great civilization in the world. But earlier in the history of China, and this is an example of that, we have signs that the Chinese dynasties, and at least a fraction of the Chinese people, were quite opened to discovering the world and trying to establish commercial relationships with other people, provided they could find the resources that they valued and could not find on their own territory. But from this moment on, the trade and the transportation of goods became easier on the Chinese side, and in the following centuries, sometimes changing itineraries and being constantly reorganized depending on the political situation of the regions that the road was going through. This commercial route continued to be exploited until it became obsolete 15 centuries later, at the end of the Middle Age, when European explorers would open sea routes towards Asia and the Americas, and for the following centuries turn Europe into the center of world trade. The Silk Road modified and sometimes developed entire regions. There are cities in Central Asia, such as Samarkand and Bukhara, which are in Uzbekistan today, that made their fortune and the magnificence of their monuments thanks to this trade and the caravans that were moving from the west to the east and from the east to the west. It could take up to several years sometimes to go from one end of the road to the other end, since there are thousands of miles of deserts, of mountains, of plains to cross under various climates. And this land trade was ensured by caravans of hundreds, sometimes even thousands of men and camels going through all these regions. Numerous people and sometimes entire countries could live on the Silk Road. They built inns for the merchants, for the travelers, and the most famous of these inns that can still be seen their remains in parts of the Middle East and Central Asia are buildings that were called Caravanserais. A caravanserai could have a different architecture depending on the local culture, but generally this was a large square building with a single door that could be closed at night, in which the caravans could find a place to securely rest, to feed their animals, and also to trade with the locals or other caravans. And if you have a chance to travel to Turkey, to Iran, to countries of Central Asia, or even in the west of China, you may have an opportunity to visit the remains of these caravanserais. Sometimes they have been turned into other buildings, hotels or warehouses, but the majority of them are ruins in the middle of the desert, and some others have entirely disappeared. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the Oriental Empire, Byzantium, maintained the road, and even later, when Byzantium was attacked and ultimately, centuries later, destroyed by the rise of the Arabs and other populations converted to Islam, it is the Islamic world that maintained alive and well the Silk Road on its western part, even developing it, and this intense traffic of goods and men also contributed to spread ideas and religions and even inventions. It is through the Silk Road that Chinese inventions such as the compass or gunpowder and silk as well, that would be later developed in Europe in the Middle Age, reached the Western world. And the religions too spread thanks to the Silk Road. Buddhism first, which from its original cradle in India reached China through the commercial links, and even Central Asia, where it encountered the Greeks, and for a short period of time this particular region of Central Asia in what is Uzbekistan today saw the creation of Greco-Buddhist buildings or works of art, an unlikely mix of two civilizations that had developed separately before. After the expansion of Islam began, it is through the Silk Road that Islam expanded towards the east, reaching Central Asia, where it remains a major religion today, and even further east and south, up to Indonesia or Malaysia, which are predominantly Muslim countries today. However, in the last part of the Middle Age, the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the Silk Road declined quite strongly. The main factor would be the rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, a Turkish nation. I will probably make a video one day about the history of the Ottoman Empire, reached to prominence first in Turkey and the Balkans by the 15th century, and then even to the entire Middle East almost, and had quite hostile relations with European and Christian powers, especially with Venice, which, as you know, was the trade gate of Western Europe in the Middle Age, and they started to embargo the exportation of goods coming from Asia, China. After they finished the conquest of Byzantium by the middle of the 15th century. And from this moment on, Venice started a massive decline. I talked about that in the video about the history of Venice. And Western Europe was actually cut from the trade with Asia. And this was one of the reasons, probably the main reason, behind the attempts by European explorers, in particular from Portugal, to try and find other routes to China. Spain, with Christopher Columbus, tried to open a road going west, believing on the other side of the ocean they would reach China. What Columbus didn't know was that there was America in between, and so he discovered America, whereas a bit later the English, the Dutch, the French would search for a route north of Canada, or even north of Siberia, without finding it, because it was technically impossible. But the Portuguese, by sailing south, explored the coasts of Africa and found a passage towards the Indian Ocean. At the very beginning of the 16th century, they reached India, and a few years later they reached China, establishing the first direct trade route between China and Europe. Until now, trade between China and the Western world had always been shared between the inhabitants of the Silk Road, all the people living in the regions the Silk Road went through. But from the 16th century, the intercontinental trade would start falling entirely in the hands of European merchants who organized the trade and made the Silk Road irrelevant. It was possible by sea to travel from China to Europe in a matter of months instead of years, and this road was also much safer since you didn't have the risk of being attacked in the vast territories of Asia by warlords or groups of robbers. Another reason that led to the abandon of the Silk Road was the collapse, the dispersion of the Mongol Empire. Another topic that will deserve a video. In the 13th century, when the Mongol Empire, that for a short period of time was the biggest, the largest land empire in all history, disappeared, the security of these trade routes in Asia collapsed, and using the Silk Road for trade became much more difficult. And the Silk Road, from a reality that lasted for about 20 centuries, quickly became a myth and a symbol too. A myth because at the scale of man in this time, the length of the Silk Road was almost unthinkable. Engaging on a trip on the Silk Road from one end to another was like going to the unknown, almost like traveling from the Earth to Mars. Today, you did not really know what your itinerary could be. This was dangerous. You had no idea what kind of people, beliefs, civilizations you would meet on the way. And it also appears as a symbol, the first attempt in the history of man at globalizing trade, at establishing connections between different ends of the world. I hope this presentation was pleasant and interesting for you, and relaxing as well. And as usual, your comments are welcome in the section below. Bye bye.